Welcome to the Tron Church Talking Points podcast. This is a conversation in the middle of the week to help us to keep on thinking about and applying the teaching that we hear Sunday by Sunday in our services. Now, apologies to all the Josh Johnston fans. He's not with us today. I'm joined instead just by Willie, Philip, our senior minister, and Paul Brennan. Paul was preaching on Proverbs on Sunday, but we thought the topic of politics and our engagement with it was such a significant one, so timely that we would devote the whole podcast to that.
Paul, I certainly found it very helpful, your message yesterday morning, and I think there was so much. It was an eye opener, perhaps to many, just to realise how many references there are to these things in Proverbs, and just showing how wide-ranging and how nuanced it was. And your first point, I think, made that so clearly when you said, we're not to put our trust in princes, and we're to obey the authorities. And so the overarching thing there is that, yes, we're not to trust people, but the overarching message that you were giving us was that rule and authority is a good thing. It's a positive thing that God has given to the world. It's a necessary thing in a sinful and a fallen world. So, and that is the point that Paul starts with in the other Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Romans 13, where he's saying the governing authorities are given by God. So we don't just grin and bear it and have to obey government because they have power. For the Christian, we've actually got a positive thing, because we have to say, well, hang on, this is a gift of God. Now, it's interesting because both of you actually have had direct experience of government. Agnes, you worked in Westminster, and Paul, you were involved there for a bit as well. It'd be worth maybe telling people a bit about that. Agnes, why don't you go first?
It feels a really long time ago now, but I was, for 8 years, civil servant policy advisor in Whitehall, in what is now the Ministry of Justice, so advising on what people cry out for, which is access to justice and justice in the courts, which obviously is something that God loves to see. So dealing with lots of, I guess, tiny issues, a very small cog and a very big wheel, but trying to see justice done and resources applied fairly. To the. And
you worked in the Lord Chancellor's office, is that right?
Yeah, so it was then called the Lord Chancellor's office. It's now called the Ministry of Justice.
Right.
But yeah.
So it's something that is at the very heart, actually, of what the Apostle Paul is talking about, as the very heart of what government is really about.
Yes. Yeah.
And a positive thing.
And just on a side note, you were talking about how Paul was talking on Sunday about advisors and people's experience, and actually you could really see that what experience a minister had, even a non-Christian minister, you could almost see in front of your eyes the impact that was having on the decisions that he was making for the rest of us. That's just an aside. It really chimed with me.
But a reminder of
time in Whitehall
of what a positive role historically there have been for Christians in government and so on. What about you, Paul? You were, was it just a year you were in Westminster?
2 years in Westminster.
2 years.
So the first year I did straight out of university. There's a charity called CARE. Christian Action, Research and Education, and they run, it's got a slightly grander title now, but it's the Care Leadership Programme. When I was there, we were just interns. But
lowly intern.
So the idea of that is to help people think Christianly about the world, about politics. So a bunch of us grads were based in Westminster. We were all placed with members of Parliament, so I worked in an MP's office 4 days a week, and then on the final day of the week, we all got together with the other care interns and thought about politics and what the Bible says about politics, how we're to engage. Did that for a year, and then I stayed on for a year working for another MP. But you see the huge amount of work that goes on, which never reaches the newspapers, but there's a lot of work across the parties genuinely doing good for people.
Lots of good-hearted people.
Yeah, dealing with real issues that impact people's lives and deliver real improvements. And that's happening all the time. But of course, that's part of the picture. But a lot of good people involved, and it's really interesting seeing behind the scenes, really.
And I think that chimes, doesn't it, with undoubtedly the biblical perspective, which is that God has, our God is the God who does good, to all he has made. He makes the sun shine and the rain fall on the unjust as well as the just. We call that, we tend to call that God's common grace, but it's God's blessing for the whole world. And government is part of that. The spheres of authority are part of that. He's given authority in the home to parents, given authority in the church, and that's a good thing, as it is in the home. But he's given certain authority to the civil powers. We'll come back maybe to talk about how these things interrelate. But it's a positive, good thing. Yet, he also tells us, put not your trust in princes. So it's clearly not, we mustn't look at, for example, Romans 13, which is often pulled out, and over the last few years has often been alluded to.
Which essentially says, submit to the authorities that God has put in place.
Yeah.
That's what we mean by Romans 13.
And often what people are doing is just taking that submit to the authorities and forgetting that the authorities are there, first of all, to do what God has told them to do, which is to promote good and punish evil. So it's far from being a blanket submission to everything just because of their authority, because the supreme authority is God. And that's a pattern, isn't it, that we see throughout Scripture, because we don't see blind obedience to authorities. We see a lot of opposition, we see a lot of disobedience and flagrant disobedience to authorities, which is praised by God.
Yeah. So, I mean, recently I was working through the book of Acts, and you see that almost from the very beginning. There are many instances where the work of the apostles comes in direct conflict with the authorities, and you see in chapter 4, Peter, they say to the civil authorities, we must obey God rather than man, and they're thrown in prison. Same happens with Paul. But that's not just a feature of the New Testament. It is a feature of the whole Bible. So think back to almost to the very beginning, book of Exodus. In the first page of Exodus, what do you see? Well, you've got great oppression of God's people in Egypt. There's that edict from Pharaoh that all the newborn baby boys are to be thrown into the River Nile. And you read there about 2 Hebrew midwives who refuse to obey Pharaoh.
And we get their names, and you don't know the name of Pharaoh.
Well, that's right, isn't that right? So they are honoured, and they were directly disobeying Pharaoh, but in order to save the lives of these babies.
And notably without a specific command of God.
Well, that's right.
To disobey Pharaoh.
So presumably they thought about it.
Yeah.
They realised that can't possibly do this.
Can't possibly be right. God's will.
Because of what else they know about the Lord and what He defines as being right and good and not evil and wrong. Further on, you think about the book of Daniel, and again, his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Think about all the pressure from the authorities to bow down to this silly god statue, but you read it and you almost laugh at it, but at the time, imagine the pressure, all the music, everyone's there on the plane to bow down, but they refuse, full well knowing the punishment is going to be thrown into the fiery furnace, and there's no guarantee to them that they would be rescued from it. But they refuse to bow down.
We could multiply examples of those.
Yeah.
I wonder if I can suggest, if parents out there, if you want to talk about these things with your kids, why not play the game of trying to think of some more from the Old Testament? Who else can you?
Yeah, well, there's plenty
Of examples.
And in each case, it's not that we prayed and then got a special command from God. It was their whole view of life, their whole understanding of the world and what's right and what's wrong, what they should and shouldn't be doing, is formed by the whole of God's revelation, by God's law.
What you were saying
wisdom.
about Romans 13, that there's a hierarchy, there's a structure in there that I'm waving my hands if you're listening whilst doing the washing up. This is no use to you, but God is sovereign over all.
Yeah, so it's not quite as simple as obey your rulers. Yeah. Because evidently through the Bible, God's people do not obey their rulers time and time again. So it's a slightly more nuanced and complex thing, isn't it?
And what Paul is doing there, because he's placing all government under God, he's clearly saying that human civil government is not just left to the arbitrary desires of those governors. He's saying that they've got a duty, first of all, to God, before they've got a duty and an authority over people. And that's the same in every sphere of authority, actually. Parents have authority over their children, but only insofar as God has given it to them and God directs them. Church leaders have got certain authorities, but only as far as God has given it, and only for the care of the flock. Now, there's always been bad parents. There's always been sinful and wicked church leaders, and we understand it's implicit in that the principle is there, but there are times when these things go wrong and have to be rightly opposed. So John Knox famously, actually, in his discussion with Mary Queen of Scots, there you've got a very clear churchman standing right up to the ruler, and they had these famous conversations, and Knox brought up his. The Queen was saying, God gives authorities, rulers, you've got to obey me and obey everything. And he said, well, God says very clearly to obey parents, to obey fathers. But everybody knows that if a father is abusing a child or whatever it is, you oppose him. You stop him doing it. You don't just oppose it and say it's wrong. You actually stop it. You intervene. You get involved. In the same way, the Bible is very clear, isn't it? Wives, submit to your husbands. But we would think it very wrong and horrific, wouldn't we? And it sometimes has happened in churches, that churches have taken that so seriously that they have allowed women to be abused, not just emotionally, but physically often. And even women have said, I must allow this to happen because, I must submit to my husband. I think all of us hopefully would say, no. That's the realm where the authority of the church has to come in, and indeed you may need the authority of the state to come in and punish that wrong and prevent that evil. So when it goes wrong, there are things that override, because ultimately all of these authorities are only under God and must be administered rightly in alignment with what God wants. In God's sovereign providence, evil rulers are sometimes are permitted to rise up. We know that. God allows the devil to have certain authority. But we don't bow down to the devil. We don't. We must resist the devil, we're told explicitly. And so we must see these things with that biblical clarity, and not just look at half the story.
And I think we've got historical examples, don't we, of people who have seen it with that kind of biblical clarity.
Yeah.
We had quite recently Bob File doing that evening with our growth groups on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who through the 1930s saw with clarity that others didn't see with what was coming down the track in terms of increasing pressure from the Nazi state, not just on wider society, but on the Christian church as well. And many in the church seemingly wanted to go with the rulers because they had a narrow reading of Romans 13 and we're told to submit, so we will do that, without really thinking, what sort of governance is this? What sort of leader is this man, Hitler? And Bonhoeffer was prepared to stand up. And
one of the very helpful things that I think Bob brought out on that was that Bonhoeffer saw where things were going. Everybody saw in the end, but he saw the direction of travel, and even other good men. So those who formed the confessing church, as opposed to the sort of the state church, which was just righted with Hitler. But many early on, even a man like Martin Niemöller, who became such a well-known name and a heroic name, early on, didn't see the direction of travel and was saying things like, we would support Hitler, even take an oath to Hitler, because actually it'll be good for our witness and it might harm our witness not to. And yet it was proven so wrong. But Bonhoeffer, of course, was closely associated with Karl Barth. They were Barth particularly was the one who framed the famous Barmen Declaration, which was the declaration of the confessing church. But these men are useful because they were working through these issues in the face of real up close, in experience growing tyranny. And it's really important we don't forget history because as I said, it didn't start just like that. It moved. But Karl Barth was very, very good. And if people want to read about it, he's got an essay called "The Christian Community and the Civil Community." And he says that, the last thing that Romans 13:1 implies is just unquestioning blind obedience to government. What it's really saying is that, look, Christians are still in this world. We're citizens of heaven, but we don't just say, we opt out of everything else. We say, no, we're still in this world. We've got a part to play in this world. And the way that the Christian church submits, the way it subordinates to government, is by bringing Christ to the very center of it all and helping people to distinguish between good and bad government, to make those distinctions between tyranny and real proper government, and showing the lordship of Christ and how that's worked. And of course, historically, that is what's so often happened, and that's what's so often been the case in the West, which, as you said, so many of the institutions that so much of the whole of the fabric of society that we've lived with for centuries has been founded on that. And perhaps we've become so used to that we begin to sort of just assume that, well, it'll always be good and it'll always be right, and you can always trust the government.
I think we sort of have defaulted to giving the government the benefit of the doubt because we've had a rich history of centuries of...
Yeah. Because we've been able to for such a long time.
Right. As they had in Germany, of course.
Yeah.
The home of the Reformation.
Yeah. And so it's hard to see when that is changing.
And when we actually have a duty to oppose.
That's right.
Yeah.
And these men would argue, and in fact, you see the same thing in the history of our own nation in Scotland. I've mentioned before a recent book by Professor Donald MacLeod of the Free Church called "Therefore the Truth I Speak," which charts Scottish theology from about 1500 to 1700 and goes through some of the great names that we'll know, from John Knox onwards, Melville, and ending up with Samuel Rutherford. Right the way through, there was a very, very clear understanding of not just a right, but a duty to stand against and to oppose tyranny. And Samuel Rutherford, who I think, Agnes, I've got to come and speak to the TY about quite soon, haven't I? I better brush up. But Samuel Rutherford wrote a classic book called Lex Rex, The Law and the King. But really his basic point was that the law is the king is not the law. And that you were making that point from Deuteronomy. The king, and we read it on Sunday morning, the king is to be from one of his own brothers. He's one of the brothers. He's just one of the people, and so he's under the word of God the same as everybody else. And he's got to have a copy of the law of God and put himself under it constantly, because what that's saying is the king is only a man. He's just one of everybody else, and he's under God. He doesn't be elevated to become God, and so you don't get to the point where I am the law. That's the word of the tyrant, isn't it? And these men saw very clearly. And so there's a whole long tradition in Scotland and very influential in the UK as a whole of seeing clearly on these things and making distinctions, and seeing the church's role to oppose what is evil, to help the government to see evil for evil and good for good. But we're now coming again into a time, I think, where increasingly good is being turned into evil and evil being turned into good. And so these issues they've not really been issues faced by the church in this country since the 17th century. So
it can be, it's very easy to look back at Bonhoeffer and say, of course he was right to oppose Hitler. Yeah. It's much harder to see it in our own day and to see trajectories. And why do you think either of you, it's been harder for us to see that ourselves in our own situation? Because we took that judicial review and we thought very carefully about what the government was saying about gathering for worship during all the lockdown restrictions. But I guess I personally felt on the back foot on that. I don't think I'd ever, it was harder to see it in our own situation than the ones in the past.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because the majority of us grew up with people very much sharing values on a whole range of topics, almost regardless of their background. So the sort of the Christian ethics and values has for a long time been at the very heart of our nation. And when you grow up with that, you just assume that's going to continue. And because we've not had major conflicts to have to work through in our living memory, really, it's a very difficult mind shift to go onto that. Oh gosh, we might have some difficult things to deal with here. And I came across that quote from a former Supreme Court justice in the US. He talked about being aware that in the twilight, everything in many ways looks the same, but darkness is coming, and it's coming very quickly. But you're not really alert to the differences that are coming. And so I think we've just been quite slow to be aware of.
I guess that means that now is the moment to be thinking these things through. It's been kind of raised with us as a teachable moment. Let's engage with the issue, because it's going to crop up again, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not going to go away in a hurry.
I think the word totalitarian came up, and it's interesting that some years back, you'll remember the Scottish government tried to bring in the named person legislation, which ultimately was overturned in the Supreme Court. And in the judgment of the Supreme Court, the justice used the word totalitarian and was saying, this is a totalitarian tendency, and said that the first thing that a totalitarian regime tries to do is to get at the children, to separate them and distance them from their parents and from others, and really make the only, I forget exactly the words, but essentially the state being the main influence on the children. Now, that's the same tendency that was there in the extreme legislation about prescribing public worship, because it wasn't just about buildings, it wasn't just about shutting buildings. Two people meeting in a park in the open air, socially distancing, would have been committing a crime if they had done that under that legislation to pray. And that the reason that we got involved with that along with others was not because this is just we don't like this, it's irritating, we'd like to be having church. That was true, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was because this was a very dangerous encroachment of the state, transgressing into an arena of authority which is not theirs. And that's really the nub of the issue. And that was upheld by the judge as being that.
Very strongly.
Very strongly, on both constitutional grounds and grounds of universal human rights. The named person issue was exactly the same transgression into a different sphere of authority, into the sphere of the family. And this is a pattern that we're now seeing, not just in our own country, but in many others, and particularly in the Anglosphere, in New Zealand, in Canada,
Australia.
in Australia, and there's a big battle in the United States. The United States is very divided on this. You've got a more conservative part and a much more liberal and progressive part. But this is where the battle lines are being drawn, and this is, I think, where we have to be very aware that we have to take the responsibility which is God-given and the authority which is God-given in these spheres of responsibility, both in the family and in the church. Resist the encroachment of the state into areas that God has not given it to control of, whilst at the same time encouraging the state to do rightly what God has given it to, which is particularly to promote that which is good and to prevent and to punish that which is evil. And good and evil there, when Paul's talking about that, is not what the state might think is good and evil. Paul, all the way through Romans, has been talking about righteousness and sinfulness and what God considers right and wrong. And so there's a very positive role, albeit potentially combative role, increasingly, for Christians in our world, of which there is not one square inch that doesn't belong to Christ, as you quoted. But also, it's not just out there, it's not just doing those things, it's taking that responsibility very clearly in our homes and within our own churches, because that is something that we all must do. And I think so we need to think about all these three different areas.
So you did say to us just towards the end of your sermon that it's your second point, we need to trust in the Lord and play our part.
Yeah.
It would be worth just chatting about a few practical examples of what playing our part would look like.
Yep. So, well, there's the things I mentioned, engaging with our representatives in the various parliaments. We can play our part in that sense, but also, just picking up what Willie was saying, that in the spheres for which we do have particular authority
And responsibility.
whether that's the home or in church, I think we've got to realise the responsibilities and authority we have in those spheres. So with the family, it is, as a father, it's my responsibility for my children in every regard of their lives, including their education. So it is up to me to whom I delegate that education. And
Which is actually in the law.
In Scottish law,
that's true.
In Scottish law, is my duty, is my responsibility where my children are educated. So whether it's in school or whether it's a private school or whether within the home, that is entirely my right. And I don't think we really thought about that. I think, given the sort of what we've grown up with, there's been a tendency to trust the government and the schools that they are going to do what we would like them to do in terms of what they teach. I don't think we can assume that anymore. And so we need to be thinking, what is actually going on in the classroom of my school? What are my children being taught? And so we've got to take that responsibility and think about it. And
be on the front
there might be
foot.
some difficult decisions to make.
And what are the priorities that God in the scriptures actually presents to us in terms of what it means to educate children and young people and prepare people for life and so on? Because we tend to just sort of assume, well, going to school must be the right thing and getting good exam results is what you hope for, and perhaps going to further education is what you hope for. And that's particularly in the last 20 years has almost become the norm for everybody, and it's certainly the way that most Christians, I suspect, generally have tended to think, because we cherish learning and knowledge and education and so on. But is that right? And what God means by teaching may be very different. And who is setting the agenda?
What is the education they're receiving?
Yeah. And what's it for?
Yeah.
And where's it leading? But I think we do now face the very real. We face the very real possibility that many more areas in life are going to be, and many more areas of employment are going to be much more difficult, if not entirely closed to Christians who won't bow down to the idol or won't bow down to the beast. If you don't sign up to the increasing demands of the woke social justice movement and all the rest of it, are these areas going to be open to you? Public service is becoming increasingly difficult, even big business increasingly difficult. So parents have got really big questions to ask. How are your children going to make a living and have a future?
I've certainly been much more conscious when I'm talking to teenagers in Tron Youth of helping them to set expectations, that they've not so set their heart, I guess, idolised a particular profession or university degree. So we talk much more about trades, because I'd rather that they were bin men for Jesus.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but just helping them to see that before it becomes a sort of crushing immediate decision that they're taking. We want to make that easier and sort of prepare the way and set expectations. I guess that will happen in families.
Well, our Lord presumably worked in a family business of carpentry and building. What's wrong with that? We do have to make. I think we it's like fish swimming in the water and not noticing the water. We make so many assumptions, don't we? And I look back and think, goodness, there's all sorts of assumptions we made bringing up our kids of the sorts of things you wanted, and actually a lot of it was just that. Well, this is just what everybody else does. I think the times are changing and the issues are going to get tougher, and I think there's a lot of thinking that Christians are going to have to do about just how best to prepare the next generation for what it's going to be. I mean, all the Christians virtually that the apostles were writing to were slaves. They were in the lowest strata of society. And although he was saying, well, you know, if you can get out of your slavery and do something else, well, fine, but that's not really the big issue. Well, you know, I think we need to challenge ourselves on that. You know, okay, maybe you can, if you set your heart on being a teacher or a lawyer or whatever it is you want to be, well, maybe, but you may find
not.
You may find it's going to be very, very difficult.
And I think being intentional about, Rod Dreher talks about the sort of warm community, safe place. I don't like that phrase, but for our young people to be part of. So I think often youngsters would have said of Tron Youth that they love coming to Tron Youth at the end of a week where they've maybe felt like a fish out of water all week, and this is where they feel they belong, and it's a warm and a loving oasis, and you know, we want our homes and our families to be that, our church family is that, and really to prioritise that very intentionally. It may seem such a mundane thing to do, is to prioritise good family relations. Just church twice on a Sunday because you get twice as much church, and you just communicate to your kids, we don't do this because we have to, we do this because we want to, that's why we come twice, and actually then they build up really good pals and friendships at church because they're there all the time, and I think those things are going to be really, really crucial in the future. We've got
to equip our children to have a thorough grounding in the Bible and a developed Christian worldview, because they've got to think about all the stuff that's going on around. They've got to be able to filter that and be discerning, and they're not that's not just going to happen.
Only trees with deep roots.
Well, that's right. You've got to think,
and stand firm.
What's our family shaped around? What do we read with them? How central is church in our family's life? Those are all things that will bear fruit in the end.
We want our young people to grow up realising that everything else in life revolves around the Lord and His church. Not that the Lord and His church get the fag ends and the bits that, you know, where there's nothing else happening, and you squeeze that into life. I mean, our kids will pick up the ethos that they live in, and they'll pick up what the families prioritise. And, you know, it's much, much more than just about what specifically we teach, or, you know, what we say and all of these things. All of that's important, but how we live all the time and where our centre is going to be something that is obvious to them. And
I imagine there's lots of people thinking, I wouldn't know how to write a letter to my MP. I certainly wouldn't want to go and meet with my MP. I wouldn't know what to say. But I think every single one of us could pick 6 families and pray for them, or pick 6 people you know who work in the public service or teachers and pray for them. If you can't pick 6, we'll supply 6. We can all do that. When I was a civil servant, I would have loved to think that somebody was praying for me. I would have wisdom for heaven in the decisions I was taking.
Well, that's a very practical thing, isn't it? That we can do, and I think I would want to say to folk, don't be slow. If ask a few folk to pray for you, and ask.
Can work both ways, can't it?
Can you share?
You
share particular battles and struggles? We want to support people. I mean, you know, we want people to be in public life. We want them to be in these areas. I just think the time may be limited when that's going to be possible, but where it is, we want to try and make that influence felt as much as we can, and pray for folk.
Yeah, good. We've gone along a little longer than we might normally, but I hope people will feel that was useful and helpful. It's a key topic, isn't it? Next week, Willie, you're back into Genesis 10 and 11. Do you have a quick title you could give us?
I think it's the transition into the world as we know it. So the beginning of the world as we know it, and we're looking at Babel and the Table of Nations. How the two sides of why the world is as it is. God has put everybody in their places and their nations. They're under His care, but they're also under His curse for sin. So we're looking at that, why the world is as it is.
Excellent. Chapter 11 will be the chapter you recognise. Chapter 10 will be the one you really, really need to read in advance.
But do read chapter 10.
Yeah, read chapter 10. And Paul,
we're in
the
Proverbs.
Evening, is that right?
Sunday evening, continuing in Proverbs. And this week we're going to think about conflict. And by conflict, I don't mean
World wars.
International world war. I'm talking about relational conflicts. And it's really, we thought about words the other week and how we speak to each other and how we resolve and deal with difficulties and conflicts.
Great, well, we'll look forward to those and to chatting about them again in Talking Points next week.